On the 5th of December, 1791, in a modest Vienna apartment, a 35-year-old composer stopped breathing just after 1 in the morning. The two doctors at his bedside couldn't agree on what had actually killed him. More than 2 centuries later, historians and physicians still haven't fully settled the question either. His name was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and the mystery around his death has produced more competing explanations than almost any other death in recorded history. Illness, poison, professional jealousy, even a secret brotherhood silencing one of its own members. Some of that is documented fact. Most of it, as we'll see, is later invention dressed up as history. This is Clue Series, and today we're opening a real investigation. Not the movie version, not the opera version, but the actual case file behind Mozart's death. What his contemporaries genuinely believed in the days after he died. How those beliefs hardened into legend over the following 2 centuries. And what modern forensic medicine has managed to determine using nothing more than the handwritten notes 2 doctors made while he was still alive. If you're into real historical mysteries, built on actual evidence rather than guesswork, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next case. Now, back to Prague, the autumn of 1791, and the moment Mozart himself first said out loud that someone was trying to kill him. A life too fast. To understand how this mystery took root, you first have to understand the pace Mozart was living at. By 1791, he was 35 years old and had already been a working professional musician for nearly 3 decades, performing for European royalty as a small child alongside his sister Nannerl, composing symphonies before he was a teenager, and producing, in barely 15 years as an adult composer in Vienna, an almost unbelievable catalog that included The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and dozens of symphonies, concertos, and chamber works. He was also, by 1791, chronically overworked and frequently short on money, borrowing from friends and colleagues to cover the gaps between commissions, moving his family between cheaper apartments more than once. His health had never been especially robust. Contemporary letters and later medical review describe repeated serious illnesses stretching back to early childhood, smallpox at 6, typhoid as a teenager, and several attacks, at different points in his life, of a joint and fever illness that many modern doctors now believe was rheumatic fever, a disease that can quietly damage the heart and kidneys for decades before it ever becomes fatal. Nobody around him in 1791 was thinking about long-term organ damage. They were thinking about deadlines. That single year alone, Mozart was juggling 2 new operas, a clarinet concerto, and a mysterious commission that would follow him, quite literally, to his deathbed. The Anonymous Stranger. In the summer of 1791, a stranger appeared at Mozart's door with an unusual request, delivered through an intermediary rather than in person. A substantial fee, paid partly in advance, for a full requiem mass, a choral setting for the dead, on the condition that the composer's name never be attached to the finished work. Mozart didn't know it, and never lived to find out. But the commission actually came from a minor nobleman, Count Franz von Walsegg, who had a documented habit of quietly buying music from struggling composers and performing it at private concerts as his own. There was nothing supernatural underneath the mystery. It was, once historians untangled it, a fairly ordinary act of vanity and mild plagiarism by a wealthy amateur. Mozart didn't have that context, and exhausted, overworked, and increasingly unwell, he became fixated on the commission in a way his wife and friends found genuinely unsettling. According to later accounts from his wife Constanze, he told her he believed he was writing the requiem for his own funeral, that the anonymous messenger felt, in his mind, almost like a premonition arriving at his door. Whether that reflects real physical decline, plain exhaustion, or a superstitious spiral in an overworked mind is something historians still debate today. What's certain is that the timing turned an ordinary commission into something that would feel, in hindsight, like a warning nobody could ignore. They have given me poison. That September, Mozart traveled to Prague for the premiere of his opera La Clemenza di Tito, composed in a punishing rush to meet a coronation deadline for the new emperor, Leopold II. While there, according to later accounts from Constanze, he became seriously ill, and in a moment of despair, he told her directly that he believed someone had given him poison, specifically naming aqua tofana, an old and notorious substance with a centuries-long reputation in Italian folklore as a slow-acting killer favored by scorned wives and jealous rivals. It's a dramatic line, and it is the single detail that has fueled more conspiracy theories about this case than anything else. But context matters. By mid-November, back in Vienna, Mozart had recovered enough to return to a full workload, conducting performances of The Magic Flute, composing, and by his own surviving letters, feeling considerably better than he had in Prague. He never repeated the poison accusation to anyone else on record, and no one around him treated it, at the time, as an ongoing or credible claim rather than the words of an exhausted, feverish man in a low moment. Most historians today read that Prague episode exactly that way. Not a documented crime in progress, but a passing moment of despair from a chronically overworked man with a long history of serious illness. Still, the sentence stuck in the historical record, and 3 months later, it would matter a great deal more than anyone in that room expected. The final weeks. 2 triumphs. Mozart returned to Vienna from Prague in mid-September and, remarkably given what was coming, entered one of the most productive stretches of his entire career. Within weeks, he completed and premiered The Magic Flute, a fantastical opera embedded with symbols and rituals drawn from Freemasonry, the fraternal society he had belonged to since 1784. It was a popular hit almost immediately, and Mozart attended performances repeatedly through October, by all contemporary accounts, in good spirits and reasonably good health, sometimes slipping backstage to play pranks on the singers. At the same time, he kept working on the anonymous Requiem commission alongside a clarinet concerto for his friend, the clarinetist Anton Stadler, composing at a pace that would exhaust a healthy man in his prime, let alone someone with a documented history of serious childhood illness. Friends and colleagues who saw him through October described someone visibly tired but fully functional, still conducting, still socializing, still meeting deadlines. Then, in the 3rd week of November, that changed abruptly. What had looked like simple exhaustion turned into something his own physicians couldn't identify or treat, and within 2 weeks, the most productive composer in Europe would be dead. The body turns. On November 20th, Mozart took to his bed and did not get up again. Contemporary accounts, including detailed notes later written down by his sister-in-law Sophie Weber, describe a rapid and frightening decline. A high, sustained fever, severe swelling in his hands and feet, so pronounced he could barely move them, a painful rash across his body, and vomiting that made it difficult to keep down food or the medicines his doctors prescribed. 2 physicians, Dr. Thomas Franz Closet and Dr. Matthias von Salaba, attended him over the following 2 weeks, applying the standard treatments of the era: repeated bloodletting, cold compresses, and various tonics, none of which addressed whatever was actually happening inside his body. This was medicine nearly a century before germ theory was widely accepted. The doctors of 1791 had no real framework for diagnosing a systemic infection or organ failure, only visible symptoms to manage as best they could with the tools available. Mozart remained mentally alert for much of this period, continuing to work on the Requiem from his sickbed, dictating instructions to his student Franz Xaver Süssmayr for how the unfinished movements should be completed if he couldn't finish them himself. According to Sophie's later account, he even attempted, with visitors gathered close around the bed, to hum through a passage of the timpani part in the unfinished score, as if the music itself might hold his condition at bay a little longer. The final days. By the start of December, Mozart's condition had worsened into something close to full-body collapse. He was too swollen to turn himself over in bed without help, in constant pain, and increasingly confused in his final 48 hours. Sophie's account describes him at one point believing he could taste death on his own tongue, and asking that the score of the Requiem be brought to his bedside one final time. Constanze, herself exhausted and afraid after 2 weeks of nursing him, moved between her husband's bedside and her own room next door, at times so overwhelmed that friends and family had to manage the sick room in her place. A priest was eventually sent for to administer last rites, though contemporary accounts differ on exactly how late in the illness that happened, and how coherent Mozart still was by the time the priest arrived at the apartment. Word of his condition had already begun to circulate through Vienna's musical circles. Colleagues sent notes checking on his health, and at least one physician who wasn't directly treating him, Dr. Closet's own account suggests, was called back to the apartment late on December 4th as the household grew increasingly alarmed. Nobody, including his own doctors, appears to have believed that morning that the end was quite this close. Within hours, it was. Death in the small hours. Mozart died just before 1 in the morning on December 5, 1791, with Sophie Weber at his bedside and Constanze in the next room. He was 35 years old. The Requiem Mass he had been composing for an anonymous nobleman lay unfinished on the desk beside him, missing several movements that his student Süssmayr would complete from his notes and verbal instructions over the following months. At Constanze's urging, so the commission fee could still be collected and the family's finances protected. The official cause of death, recorded by the attending physician, was hitziges Frieselfieber, roughly translated as severe miliary fever, a description of visible symptoms, the fever and the raised millet seed-like rash, rather than an actual diagnosis in the modern medical sense. It told contemporaries that he had died with a fever and a rash. It told them almost nothing about which disease had actually produced those symptoms in the first place. That vague, purely descriptive death record is, in many ways, the real origin point of everything that follows in this story. When an official cause of death doesn't actually explain anything, people reach for their own explanations, and in Vienna, in the winter of 1791, those explanations began circulating within days, some cautiously medical, some considerably stranger. The rumors begin. A grave like any other. One of the most persistent pieces of the Mozart legend is the idea that history's greatest composer died broke and unloved, and was dumped into an anonymous mass pauper's grave with no mourners, no marker, and no dignity. It's one of the most repeated details in the entire story, endlessly reproduced in documentaries and even school textbooks. According to the actual historical record, it's also largely false. Under strict burial reforms passed by Emperor Joseph II and continued by his successor, Leopold II, Vienna in 1791 required simple, standardized burials for almost the entire population, regardless of wealth or social status. A plain linen shroud instead of an elaborate coffin, and burial in a shared communal plot, rather than an individual monument, specifically to speed decomposition and control disease in the city's crowded cemeteries. Mozart's funeral followed exactly this ordinary, unremarkable civic procedure, the same one virtually every middle-class Viennese citizen received that year. It reflected imperial sanitary policy, not personal poverty or public indifference. A contemporary diary entry from a Viennese civil servant, dated the day after the funeral, even records the actual weather as mild, with light mist and a gentle north wind, directly contradicting the famous romantic image of a lone grieving widow standing in a howling snowstorm. That dramatic scene, like the pauper's grave, appears to be a later invention layered onto what was, at the time, a fairly routine burial for an ordinary Viennese subject of the empire. Vienna starts talking. Within days of Mozart's death, rumors of poisoning were already circulating through Vienna's musical circles, and they spread fast enough that a Prague newspaper reported the suspicion in print before the month was out. Part of this was simply human nature. A famous, relatively young man had died suddenly after months of visible overwork, and a vague, purely symptomatic official cause of death gave gossip plenty of room to grow into something more dramatic. But there was a specific target for that gossip almost from the very start. A respected court composer and one of Vienna's most powerful musical figures, widely believed by contemporaries, fairly or not, to have felt threatened by Mozart's talent for years. He had never been formally accused of anything while Mozart was alive, but the professional rivalry between the two men was real, well documented in surviving letters, and in the absence of any real medical explanation for Mozart's death. The Viennese public reached for the most dramatic story available, not slow illness, but jealousy, turned lethal. The rival. That rival was Antonio Salieri, the Italian-born court composer who had, by 1791, spent nearly 2 decades as one of the most influential musicians in Vienna, controlling access to the prestigious court commissions and teaching positions that Mozart, working as a freelance composer without an official court appointment, badly wanted and only occasionally received. Their relationship was, by contemporary accounts, genuinely competitive, but not the cartoonish blood feud that later fiction would invent. The two men served on the same audition juries, attended the same performances, and by some surviving accounts, occasionally praised each other's work in writing, and even collaborated on a small cantata together. Mozart did complain, in private letters home to his father, about intrigue and favoritism at the Viennese court, and it's entirely plausible Salieri was sometimes involved in the ordinary professional politics of the era. That is a very different thing from murder. For roughly 3 decades after Mozart's death, the rivalry stayed a matter of gossip and speculation, nothing more concrete. Then, in 1823, an elderly and increasingly unwell Salieri gave the story a detail nobody could afford to ignore. During a period of serious mental decline, he appeared to accuse himself, out loud, in front of witnesses. The Brotherhood. A second, quieter theory has also followed Mozart for 2 centuries, that his death wasn't personal at all, but institutional, that his fellow Freemasons, the secretive fraternal society he had belonged to since 1784, had him silenced for exposing their private rituals a little too clearly in the symbolism of the magic flute. It's a compelling premise for a mystery, and it's worth taking seriously enough to examine properly, which we will in a later chapter. But it's worth flagging now that the theory has one immediate, glaring problem. Mozart's own Masonic lodge did not distance itself from him after his death. Quite the opposite. His lodge held a formal memorial ceremony in his honor within weeks of his passing, and fellow Freemasons were directly involved in raising money and providing financial support to his widow and 2 surviving young sons in the months and years that followed. That is an unusual way to treat a member you had supposedly just arranged to have killed for talking too much. Still, The theory has persisted for generations, so let's build the actual case for it and against it with the same rigor we're applying to Salieri, rather than dismissing either one out of hand. The Myth Machine. A play, an opera, a movie. The Salieri poisoning story didn't stay a private Vienna rumor confined to one city's gossip. It became art, repeatedly, across more than a century and a half. And each new version made the myth more vivid, more emotionally convincing, and more widely believed than the last. In 1830, the Russian poet Alexander Pushkin wrote a short dramatic play titled Mozart and Salieri, portraying the rivalry as literal, deliberate murder driven by consuming envy. It was fiction, explicitly framed by Pushkin himself as dramatic imagination, built on decades-old gossip he'd heard secondhand. But it gave the rumor a permanent, quotable literary form that outlived the original whispers. Decades later, the composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov adapted Pushkin's play into a full opera, cementing the poisoning story even further into European high culture, still explicitly presented as a fictional dramatization rather than a documented historical claim. The story reached its widest audience yet in the 20th century, first as Peter Schaffer's 1979 stage play, Amadeus, then as the 1984 film adaptation, which won 8 Academy Awards and introduced the poisoning legend to tens of millions of viewers who had likely never heard the name Salieri before. Both the play and the film are genuinely brilliant, thoughtful drama. Neither one claims, if you read the author's own notes carefully, to be a factual documentary account. But audiences at the multiplex don't always make that careful distinction, and over 40 years, the myth thoroughly outran its own fine print. Salieri on trial. So does the actual surviving historical evidence support Salieri as a genuine murderer? Let's build the case honestly, weighing both sides the way any real investigation would. The case for the two men were real, documented professional rivals, competing for years over the same limited pool of court patronage and prestigious teaching positions. In 1823, an elderly Salieri, hospitalized during a severe mental and physical breakdown, reportedly told at least 2 visitors he had poisoned Mozart, and appears to have been disturbed enough by his own guilt-ridden delusions to attempt suicide shortly afterward. Those are genuine documented historical details, not something invented by later biographers. The case against. By every surviving account from people who actually visited Salieri during that same hospitalization, including his own music students and, notably, written entries in Beethoven's surviving conversation books, Salieri's confession came during a well-documented period of dementia-like confusion, and he explicitly retracted it completely during his lucid periods, telling a visiting priest in plain language that the poisoning rumor was, in his own words, an absurd lie with no truth to it whatsoever. No toxicological or symptomatic evidence from Mozart's actual 2-week final illness supports poisoning of any kind. The extended, fluctuating, gradually worsening symptom pattern doctors recorded doesn't match how period poisons like aqua tofana were understood to act. And Salieri, far from resenting Mozart's memory once the rivalry had faded, later personally taught music to Mozart's own younger son, Franz Xaver Mozart, for years, free of charge. Weighing all of that together, the historical consensus among serious biographers is about as clear as these cases ever get. No credible evidence that Salieri poisoned Mozart, and a considerable body of evidence suggesting strongly that he did not. The Masonic theory examined. Now, the Masonic silencing theory held to that exact same standard of evidence. The case for it: the magic flute does contain genuine, well-documented Masonic symbolism drawn from real initiation rituals, and some of Mozart's actual lodge brothers reportedly felt uneasy about how openly those private symbols were staged in front of a paying public audience. Secret societies working to protect their own secrets is not, on its own, an unreasonable premise for a historian to at least investigate. The case against it: there is no surviving document, witness testimony, or physical evidence of any kind connecting any specific Freemason to Mozart's illness or his death. His own lodge's public memorial tribute, organized and held within weeks of his death, directly contradicts the idea that his brothers wanted him silenced or gone. And critically, the medical record we actually possess, 2 full weeks of fluctuating fever, whole body swelling, and a spreading rash, matches a slow systemic illness far better than it matches any known period poisoning method, secret fraternal order, or otherwise. Serious historians generally treat the Masonic theory the same way they treat the Salieri theory, an appealing, well-constructed story rather than a properly supported one. It borrows real, verifiable ingredients from Mozart's actual life, his genuine Masonic membership, the genuine symbolism embedded in his final opera, and builds an entirely unsupported murder plot on top of them. Real ingredients, invented conclusion, exactly the technique that made both stories so durable for so long. What the evidence actually says. Strip away both conspiracy theories entirely, and here is what actually survives careful contact with the historical record. 2 named, attending physicians, writing in real time as Mozart lay dying, independently describing fever, severe limb swelling, a spreading rash, and persistent vomiting over roughly 2 full weeks. A slow, escalating, whole-body decline, not a sudden acute collapse consistent with a single poisoning event. No account from anyone actually present in the sick room mentions symptoms consistent with the acute metallic or arsenic-based poisons available and understood in 1791, and no physical or documentary evidence beyond one elderly, unwell man's confused confession 3 decades later connects any specific named person to his death in any credible way. What we're left with, once you clear away all the drama, is a genuine unsolved medical case, not a genuine unsolved murder case. That is admittedly a far less thrilling story than a scheming rival slipping poison into a glass of wine. It also happens to be the version the actual surviving evidence supports. And it is exactly the kind of case that modern forensic medicine, working from those same 230-year-old doctor's notes, has spent the last several decades quietly trying to solve for good. What science found? 136 diagnoses. Modern doctors love a well-documented historical case file, and Mozart's has become one of the most picked over in all of medical history. By one count published in recent medical literature, more than 136 different retrospective diagnoses have been proposed over the years for what actually killed him, ranging from kidney disease to tuberculosis to trichinosis, a parasitic infection contracted from undercooked pork that one prominent researcher argued for in a widely discussed 2001 paper. That striking number alone tells you something important about this case. With only 2 doctors' symptom descriptions to work from and no surviving body left to examine directly, absolute certainty is almost certainly impossible now. But impossible to be perfectly certain doesn't mean every theory is equally credible. Some of those 136 proposed diagnoses fit the documented symptoms and timeline far better than others, and over the last 2 decades, 2 candidates in particular have pulled clearly ahead of the rest in serious medical literature. Let's examine both carefully, because taken together, they likely bring us as close to the real answer as we're ever going to get. The strep throat theory. The first strong candidate, published by a Dutch research team in 2009 after they systematically combed through Vienna's official municipal death registers for the winter of 1791, is streptococcal infection. Their study identified a documented spike in deaths from edema-related illness across the city that same season, suggesting a genuine local outbreak moving through Vienna's population, rather than one isolated, unexplainable case. The theory works like this. An initial streptococcal throat infection triggers an overwhelming autoimmune response throughout the entire body, producing exactly the kind of severe, whole-body swelling that Mozart's sister-in-law Sophie described firsthand in her own written account of his final illness. It's also fully consistent with his documented childhood history of rheumatic fever, itself a related streptococcal complication that can leave lasting, invisible damage to the heart and kidneys for decades before eventually triggering a fatal crisis. A crisis often set off by exactly the kind of new, ordinary infection Mozart may well have picked up that particular winter. In plain terms, a serious childhood illness roughly 3 decades earlier may have quietly set a trap that one routine winter infection finally sprang shut. The kidney failure theory. The second leading modern theory looks at that same set of symptoms and lands on kidney failure specifically, a condition called uremia, in which kidneys that can no longer properly filter the blood allow waste products to build up steadily throughout the body, producing exactly the fever, swelling, and mental confusion multiple witnesses independently described during Mozart's final 2 weeks. Notably, this theory and the streptococcal theory aren't actually competing explanations at all. Most researchers who have studied the case in real depth now believe the two describe the very same underlying event, simply viewed from 2 different medical angles. A childhood bout of rheumatic fever silently damaged Mozart's kidneys and heart over roughly 2 decades, and then one final acute infection in the winter of 1791, whether strep throat or something closely related, pushed already compromised kidneys past the point of no return. It is not, in any sense, a dramatic culprit. There is no villain anywhere in this version of the story. But of the more than 100 theories proposed across 2 centuries of speculation, this particular combination, old hidden damage plus one final infection, currently fits the full documented symptom picture better than any competing explanation on record, including every version of poison. Constanze's long shadow. One more figure deserves real credit and real scrutiny in how this entire story eventually reached us. Mozart's widow, Constanze. In the immediate aftermath of his death, she was left with 2 young sons, significant debts, and an unfinished requiem still owed to an anonymous patron. She organized benefit concerts, secured a court pension, and personally saw to it that Süssmayr completed the missing movements so the commission fee could still be collected. Years later, she remarried a Danish diplomat named Georg Nicholas von Nissen, who spent much of his retirement compiling the first major biography of Mozart, drawing heavily on Constanze's own letters, memories, and carefully preserved documents. That biography, published shortly after Nissen's death in 1828, shaped how the public understood Mozart for generations. It was also, by later scholarly analysis, selectively edited. Some letters were trimmed or destroyed outright, ordinary family friction and unflattering details smoothed away, in what appears to have been a genuine effort to protect her late husband's reputation and secure his place in history. None of that makes Constanze a villain in this story. It makes her something more human, a widow managing grief, finances, and legacy all at once, decades before professional historians existed to do that work more objectively. But it does mean some of the emotional shading around Mozart's final months, the devoted household, the tragic timing, the sense of a life cut short by dark forces, passed through a widow's careful hand before it ever reached us, And that's worth remembering every time this story gets retold. The verdict and the legacy. So, murder, illness, or myth? Based on everything the actual historical and medical record supports, the honest answer is illness, wrapped in more than 2 centuries of accumulated myth, with no credible evidence anywhere in that record of actual murder. Mozart almost certainly died of a genuine, natural medical crisis, very possibly a lifetime of quiet, invisible damage from childhood rheumatic fever, finally overwhelmed by one more ordinary infection in the winter of 1791, and misdiagnosed at the time by physicians who simply had no scientific framework yet for understanding what was actually happening inside his body. The poisoning story, as compelling as it has become across 2 centuries of plays, an opera, and an Oscar-winning film, appears to be exactly what his own doctors accidentally created the moment they wrote down a vague, purely symptomatic cause of death. An empty box that popular imagination filled in with a villain, because a villain has always made a far more satisfying story than a silent, 30-year medical time bomb. What's not in any dispute at all is the work he left behind. More than 600 compositions in barely 3 decades of adult life, written at a pace that still genuinely stuns musicians today, including a Requiem Mass, unfinished at his death, that has since been performed at funerals, memorials, and remembrances all over the world, for strangers, for monarchs, and, quite literally, for Mozart himself. If you enjoyed this investigation, there's another real historical mystery waiting in the next Clue Series case. Subscribe, and we'll see you there.